The deadbolt was thrown from the inside. Yet Julian Vance vanished into thin air without disturbing a single lock or latch. Welcome to Swasti Diaries. Tonight, we examine a quiet, meticulously planned tragedy where nothing, least of all the paperwork, was ever what it seemed. Arthur Pendelton sat in his high-backed leather chair, watching the rain streak against the reinforced window panes, fully aware that his newly acquired lodger carried an erased history. Julian Vance had rented the upper-floor unit 3 weeks prior, presenting credentials so crisp and pristine they practically invited suspicion. Yet, Detective Miller chose to ignore the subtle discrepancies in the lease agreement, harboring a private grievance that simmered beneath the surface of his professional duty. When the authorities finally breached the threshold of the rental unit, they did not find a chaotic struggle or a forced entry. They found absolute order, a chilling lack of disturbance, and one devastating impossibility: a secured room containing no living soul, no body, and a chemical residue on the floorboards that pointed to a calculated cleanup. The apartment was completely sealed from within, guarding secrets that defied every rule of logic and physics. How does a man vanish from a locked room, leaving behind only the cold phantom of his forged identity? Before the heavy debt crushed his retirement, Arthur Pendelton always kept a worn silver pocket watch tucked inside his waistcoat pocket, a final heirloom from his late grandfather that he checked compulsively every hour. That quiet habit defined his orderly, predictable existence, an existence that unraveled completely the night Julian Vance arrived at his doorstep. Financial desperation had quietly cornered Arthur, leaving him with no choice but to lease the upper-floor unit to a stranger whose credentials appeared uncomfortably pristine. Julian walked into the house carrying a heavy leather briefcase and an aura of calculated calmness, offering a rental deposit in crisp, untraceable cash. Arthur accepted the money without asking difficult questions, blinded by his own mounting liabilities. Yet, beneath that polite exterior, Julian harbored an aggressive agenda that had nothing to do with renting a simple room. The forged lease agreement discovered later proved that the tenant had planned his entry weeks in advance, weaponizing stolen credentials to infiltrate the household. But why would a man go to such extraordinary lengths to secure a temporary lodging above an aging homeowner? The answer lay buried in a shared history of embezzlement that Arthur thought he had buried decades ago. As the investigation deepens, the focus shifts to the subtle financial transfers and the forged documents left behind in the silent room. The threshold of the upper-floor rental unit did not offer the chaos of a struggle, but rather the sterile silence of a room that had been deliberately scrubbed of its own history. Detective Miller stepped across the polished wooden floorboards, his gaze dropping immediately to the faint, iridescent sheen left near the corner of the baseboard. It was a chemical stain, thin and barely perceptible under the harsh glare of a handheld utility light, yet it spoke volumes about what had occurred here before the authorities were summoned. Someone had gone to meticulous lengths to erase the organic evidence of violence, using a specialized solvent that dissolved blood spatter without damaging the surrounding varnish. There were no signs of forced entry on the brass deadbolt, and the double-paned glass windows remained securely latched against the damp midnight chill outside. Yet, the absence of struggle was deeply unsettling. A half-empty glass of amber liquid sat untouched on the mahogany side table, casting a distorted reflection across the polished surface. Beside it, an open leather portfolio lay discarded, its inner compartments rifled through with quiet deliberation. The air inside the room carried the faint, bitter scent of industrial cleaning agent, mixed with stagnant rain, replacing the familiar domestic odors that should have defined a rented home. Arthur Pendelton remained downstairs, waiting in the shadows of the lower hallway, knowing that the pristine appearance of the upper room was nothing more than an elaborate mask. Every physical detail inside that sealed space pointed to a premeditated cleanup, a calculated disappearance designed to leave no trace behind. But the chemical residue left a silent testimony that the perpetrator had missed one critical square inch of the floorboards, a microscopic oversight that shattered the illusion of a clean escape. The chemical residue on the floorboards told a very specific story of preparation and intent. Detective Miller knelt beside the baseboard, studying the faint iridescence under his flashlight with a practiced eye that missed very little. This was not the chaotic cleanup of a panicked intruder, but the precise neutralization of biological evidence using a high-grade solvent rarely found in standard household kits. Whoever wiped that corner of the room knew exactly what they were looking for, and how to dissolve it without disturbing the surrounding varnish. Yet, in their rush to sanitize the space, they overlooked a microscopic fiber caught beneath the edge of the radiator, a dark woolen thread that did not match any garment owned by Arthur Pendelton. Arthur remained downstairs in the quiet hallway, his thoughts drifting back to the forged lease agreement that had brought Julian Vance into his life in the first place. The credentials had been flawless, bearing official stamps and verified signatures that easily bypassed initial scrutiny. But as Miller examined the torn pages of the portfolio left on the mahogany table, a darker reality began to take shape. The document was not merely fake. It was constructed with insider knowledge, utilizing specific registry codes that only someone intimately familiar with municipal archives could access. Julian had not simply rented a room to find a temporary home. He had infiltrated the house using a fabricated past, building a bridge straight toward Arthur's deepest financial vulnerabilities. And yet, the central puzzle remained untouched. If the deadbolt was thrown firmly from the inside and the windows were latched against the midnight rain, the physical exit of the tenant defied every known law of mechanics. Miller stared at the pristine brass latch, realizing that the chemical stain on the floor was not just a cleanup of blood, but a deliberate distraction designed to draw attention away from a much deeper architectural impossibility. The forged lease agreement was never meant to secure a home. It was designed as a key to a much larger vault of deception. When Detective Miller finally cross-referenced the registry codes on Julian Vance's application with municipal tax archives from 20 years prior, a chilling realization took hold. The numbers on the document did not merely replicate a valid format. They mirrored the exact sequence used during the liquidation of Arthur Pendelton's former corporate enterprise. Julian had not stumbled upon Arthur by chance or through a standard rental listing. He had engineered his own arrival using internal registry knowledge that only a handful of disgraced executives ever possessed. This changed the entire architecture of the investigation. The locked room was not a crime scene born of sudden violence or a mysterious abduction. It was a carefully constructed stage, prepared down to the last chemical wipe to communicate a very specific message to the homeowner below. Arthur Pendelton sat in the dim downstairs hallway, his fingers tracing the edge of his worn pocket watch, as he realized that the tenant living above him had never been a stranger at all. Every signature, every stamped seal, and every fabricated credential pointed toward a meticulous reclamation project that had been decades in the making. Yet, the physical contradiction of the locked door remained unresolved. How could a man who orchestrated such a complex revenge plot vanish through a deadbolt exit without leaving a single mechanical trace? The deeper the investigation cut into the past, the clearer it became that Arthur Pendelton was not the only player in this intricate game. Two distinct figures emerged from the shadows of that forgotten corporate embezzlement scheme, each harboring a powerful motive to reclaim what was lost or conceal what was buried. The first suspect was Marcus Sterling, a former junior partner who took the fall during the company's collapse 20 years ago and spent a decade behind bars while Arthur walked free. Marcus had recently been released, carrying a bitter resentment and a documented history of meticulous planning. The second figure was Clara Sterling, Marcus's estranged sister, who worked as a senior archivist in the municipal tax department, the exact office that housed the registry codes found on Julian Vance's forged lease. Both individuals possessed the insider knowledge, the bitter grievance, and the mechanical skill required to infiltrate Arthur's household. Yet, neither Marcus nor Clara fit the physical impossibility of the locked room. Marcus possessed a rigid, methodical temperament that shunned chaotic violence, while Clara maintained an alibi that placed her across the city during the estimated hour of the disappearance. As Detective Miller analyzed the financial ledgers and the overlapping timelines, a troubling realization surfaced. These two suspects were not acting against Julian Vance. They were working in quiet tandem with him. The tenant who rented the upper floor unit was merely the executioner of a much larger conspiracy orchestrated by the Sterling siblings. But if multiple minds engineered the trap, who actually turned the deadbolt from the inside and vanished without a trace? The timeline provided by Clara Sterling began to fracture under the weight of municipal transit logs. While she claimed to have spent the entire midnight hour across the city managing archival audits, automated traffic cameras captured her vehicle idling 3 blocks from Arthur Pendelton's residence at precisely 12:15. This single discrepancy dismantled the comfortable alibi that shielded the Sterling family from direct suspicion. Detective Miller cross-referenced the transit data with the partial security recording recovered from the neighboring alleyway. A grainy snippet of digital footage that revealed a third, unidentified silhouette slipping through the side gate just minutes after the streetlights flickered off. The presence of an outside accomplice changed everything. Julian Vance had not executed this complex infiltration entirely alone. Someone on the outside held the secondary set of keys, unlocking the perimeter path while the tenant secured the upper floor unit from within. Arthur Pendelton sat in the darkened study downstairs, listening to the steady drip of rain outside, forced to confront the chilling reality that his past had not merely caught up to him, it had breached his home through a coordinated conspiracy. Every ledger entry and forged signature pointed back to the corporate liquidation 20 years ago. Yet the physical contradiction of the locked door remained unbroken. If Clara's vehicle was parked near the alley and an unknown operative slipped through the gate, how did the tenant vanish from a room that possessed no internal exit? The answer rested entirely upon a hidden mechanism built into the architecture of the house itself. The transit logs and municipal vehicle sightings initially placed Clara Sterling at the center of a coordinated conspiracy, but a meticulous re-examination of the traffic camera footage exposed a glaring error in the initial detective work. The vehicle captured near Arthur Pendelton's residence at 12:15 was not Clara's sedan. It was a completely different make and model, registered under a dormant corporate shell company tied directly to Julian Vance himself. The alibi that seemingly collapsed had actually been a carefully planted false trail, engineered to misdirect the investigation away from the true nature of the infiltration. Detective Miller stared at the corrected timestamp on the digital monitor, realizing that Clara Sterling had never left her municipal archive desk that night. Instead, Julian had utilized a secondary vehicle to stage a phantom presence in the alley, deliberately manufacturing an external accomplice where none existed. The physical evidence began to realign under this sharper lens. The chemical stain on the floorboards, the forged lease agreement, and the phantom vehicle outside were all pieces of a solitary, brilliant reclamation puzzle, designed by a man who trusted no one else to finish his work. Yet, the core paradox deepened with this revelation. If Julian acted alone and manufactured his own decoy trail, how did he negotiate a locked room with 0 internal exits without leaving a single mechanical trace behind? The deeper the ledgers were examined, the clearer it became that the vendetta was fueled by something far heavier than mere stolen capital. Arthur Pendleton had not simply ruined a company 2 decades ago. He had systematically dismantled the livelihoods of the junior partners who trusted him, leaving Marcus Sterling to take the solitary legal fall, while Arthur retreated behind a shield of respectable bourgeois stability. Julian Vance had been recruited not as a random mercenary, but as a living reminder of that debt. A man whose own family had lost everything during the liquidation, transforming a youthful tragedy into a lifelong obsession. Detective Miller traced the handwritten notations inside the recovered leather portfolio, noting how every single financial column aligned precisely with the dates of the corporate collapse. The psychological wound was deep, rooted in a betrayal that festered through years of silent planning. Yet, this intense motive did not explain the physical impossibility of the locked room. A man driven by revenge does not simply dissolve into thin air behind a deadbolt door, unless the architecture of the room itself was designed to accommodate a phantom exit. The financial ledgers laid bare the why, but the how remained stubbornly out of reach, protected by the silence of the polished wooden floorboards and the unyielding brass latch. For a brief, decisive moment, the entire chaotic puzzle seemed to snap together under the weight of accumulated evidence. Detective Miller reviewed the final stack of recovered manifests, pointing to Marcus Sterling's signed confession and the matching serial numbers on the financial ledgers as the definitive key to the mystery. The prosecution had its primary suspect, the motive of corporate revenge was firmly established, and the sealed rental unit appeared to be nothing more than an elaborate stage managed by a desperate conspirator trying to orchestrate his own dramatic exit from a ruined life. The case was closed on paper, neatly tied with the ribbon of logical human motive and verifiable financial history. But forensic certainty is a fragile construct, easily shattered by a single overlooked physical discrepancy. When the crime scene technicians re-examined the inner mechanism of the brass deadbolt during a final sweep of the upper floor unit, they uncovered a microscopic copper shaving lodged deep within the locking tumblers. A microscopic anomaly that completely demolished the neat narrative of a human accomplice turning the key from the inside. Marcus Sterling had a watertight alibi for the exact minute that copper shaving was sheared off under high torque. If the primary suspect was sitting across town in an interrogation room at midnight, who operated the secondary latch mechanism from the inside of a sealed, empty room? The microscopic copper shaving discovered in the deadbolt tumblers completely dismantled the narrative of an inside accomplice turning the key from within the sealed room. Detective Miller stared through the magnifying loupe at the tiny brass fragment, recognizing that the lock had not been manipulated by a human hand standing inside that upper floor unit. It had been triggered externally through a subtle, ingenious mechanical bypass wire threaded beneath the door frame during the midnight storm. The forged lease agreement, the chemical cleanup on the floorboards, and the meticulously planted false transit logs were all designed to force an immediate, flawed conclusion. Yet, the physical evidence pointed toward a cold, calculated setup orchestrated entirely by Julian Vance himself. He had not vanished into thin air, nor had he escaped through a phantom door. He had constructed an elaborate mechanism of misdirection to frame Arthur Pendelton for a crime that was, in reality, an intricate disappearance act. But as the true nature of the trap came into sharp focus, a darker question lingered in the shadows of the old house. If Julian planned every detail of his own staged exit to trap Arthur, why did Detective Miller quietly suppress the chemical analysis report from the very beginning of the case? Reconstructing the final hours inside the upper floor unit required a brutal adherence to physical reality rather than emotional assumption. Detective Miller mapped the exact trajectory of the bypass wire, tracing how a flexible filament could slip beneath the weather stripping of the heavy oak door, and engaged the brass tumblers from the hallway outside. The mechanics were precise, cold, and entirely devoid of supernatural intervention. Julian Vance had not vanished through a locked barrier. He had engineered a controlled mechanical disengagement before slipping out through the service stairwell while the storm masked his footsteps. Every piece of furniture, every chemical wipe on the baseboard, and every forged document served a singular purpose: to create an inescapable shadow that pointed directly at Arthur Pendelton. Yet, the physical evidence contained a fatal flaw in its own perfection. A manufactured disappearance leaves a signature rhythm of hurried footsteps and misplaced items that a genuine phantom never bothers to correct. Miller noted how the half-empty glass of amber liquid on the mahogany table had settled over a fine layer of dust undisturbed by the wind, proving the drink was poured hours after the windows were latched. The timeline cracked wide open under this scrutiny, revealing that Julian Vance orchestrated his own exit not to escape the law, but to anchor Arthur permanently to a crime scene that was entirely empty of a body. But if Julian walked out alive under the cover of midnight, where did he choose to bury his forged identity? The physical puzzle of the locked room had been systematically dismantled, leaving behind a stark and unsettling reality. Julian Vance had not vanished into the supernatural ether, nor had he escaped through impossible geometry. He had merely exploited the rigid assumptions of the investigators, leveraging the forged lease agreement and the chemical cleanup to construct an elaborate illusion of an escape. Yet, as Detective Miller reviewed the timeline of the transit logs once more, A profound discrepancy emerged regarding the two primary suspects. Marcus Sterling possessed the motive and the corporate grievance, but lacked the technical proximity to manipulate the deadbolt during the storm. Clara Sterling, on the other hand, maintained an unshakable alibi for her municipal desk, yet her vehicle registry codes were curiously linked to the very shell company that funded Julian's infiltration. The doubt narrowed down sharply between these two siblings. Either Marcus engineered the mechanical bypass from the shadows while maintaining a false front, or Clara used her archival access to orchestrate the entire setup while her brother took the physical risk. One of those two alibis was an absolute lie, carefully constructed to shield the real architect of the disappearance. As the rain continued to beat against the window panes of the old house, the final question remained suspended in the quiet air. Which of the Sterling siblings held the other half of the key to Arthur Pendleton's ruin? Marcus Sterling executed the final phase of the conspiracy, standing in the cold alley while Julian Vance manipulated the mechanical bypass wire from inside the upper floor unit. The complete truth of that midnight sequence finally emerged from the forensic archives and the suppressed reports. Detective Miller had deliberately overlooked the forged lease agreements not out of incompetence, but because he shared a forgotten familial tie with the victims of Arthur Pendleton's original corporate collapse, a private vendetta that mirrored Julian's own quest for retribution. Miller wanted Arthur to suffer the psychological terror of an inescapable, phantom crime scene, knowing that no physical body would ever be found because Julian had simply walked out through the service stairwell, using a duplicate set of keys provided by Clara Sterling. The locked room was a meticulously crafted illusion, engineered by the Sterling siblings and Julian Vance to trap Arthur inside his own financial history. The chemical solvent on the floorboards had not erased a murder. It had dissolved the footprints of the living tenant who walked away into the rainy night, leaving Arthur alone with the ticking pocket watch and the crushing weight of a ruined empire. The rain finally subsided, leaving behind a cold, reflective film over the cobblestone street outside Arthur Pendleton's quiet house. The heavy mahogany door remained closed, sealing away decades of suppressed guilt and meticulously engineered deception. Arthur sat alone in his high-backed leather chair, staring down at the polished brass lid of his worn silver pocket watch, the same heirloom he had checked obsessively the night Julian Vance first walked through his doorway. The ticking had stopped hours ago, mirroring the absolute stillness that now filled every corner of the upper floor rental unit. There was no dramatic confrontation in the end, no flashing police sirens cutting through the dark, and no recovered body to validate the elaborate tragedy. There was only the bitter realization of a trap that had caught its architect as securely as its target. Julian Vance had walked away into the rainy night, leaving behind a phantom footprint and an empty room, while Detective Miller closed the case file without a single word of public explanation. The balance had shifted, but nothing was truly restored. The past simply locked its deadbolt from the inside, guarding secrets that time could never quite dissolve. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the shadows of human motive. If you enjoyed uncovering these hidden truths, please subscribe to Swasti Diaries.